Okay, so this is my third video now related to the Ferguson armrest. Um, I wasn't sure whether to make this or not because I don't suppose I'd be particularly contributing anything. However, there's been so much back and forth and so many idiotic statements online from a lot of different people that I just want to throw my 50 cents in just to show that there are people out there, including myself, who have somewhat neutral views, because I think this has been a very polarizing debate, um, and there's been very little middle ground. What I've seen is a lot of opinions either very strongly in favour of Michael Brown or very strongly in favour of Officer Wilson. Um, I've been following a lot of news reports. I've been looking at a lot of material, and I've seen two videos. The two videos I've seen is one video purportedly showing Michael Brown robbing a store. I haven't seen any hard evidence to suggest that it's anyone else other than Michael Brown. I haven't seen anyone really dispute that strongly, one or two people, but I think most people would agree it is Michael Brown. And I've also seen the interview on, I think it was CNN, with Officer Wilson. So I think I've seen quite a lot to say something at this stage. But I want to emphasize that I, like everyone else, doesn't know the full story. I don't know if there was many witnesses there or not, but the only people that know the whole truth is Officer Wilson and anyone who may have saw that, and even the people who saw that wouldn't have necessarily known everything. Of course, Michael Brown is dead, so we can't hear his side, and that is something that needs to be pointed out. Anyway, I want to be objective on this and sort of comment on both perspectives. Firstly, regarding the interview with Officer Wilson, whether I believe him or not, I don't really know. I can't, when it comes to something like truth, the fact of the matter is I was not there. And what I find interesting is so many people rush to judgment about truth without knowing the facts. Now, you cannot determine truth simply from someone's reflections on a situation, because I don't know if Officer Wilson is telling the truth or not. I simply don't know. What I will say is, I saw the footage of Michael Brown robbing the store, and it's pretty obvious this guy was no saint. Now, this is a significant point. I want to talk a little bit about this. The video basically shows him and his friends going into a store and pushing their way around. And it certainly, I understand that Michael Brown's father has said this is a character assassination, but the footage speaks for itself. He pushes the store owner around. He's acting like a thug, basically. That's not a character assassination. It is just using your eyes. A character assassination would be accusing him of that without any sort of evidence. Now, I heard woman saying that technology means you can manipulate it, and that might be true, but I haven't seen anyone credibly offer any alternative. I mean, if what she says is that was somebody else, then who is this mystery person? So, without that, then we have to assume it is Michael Brown. And in that sense, he's acting like a thug. Now, of course, that doesn't mean he deserves to die for stealing something and being a bully. Doesn't mean he deserves to be shot in cold blood. Of course not. But the point here is that it is significant. In other words, if he's prepared to rob a store and push his way around, then I think he would be capable of having an attitude towards a law enforcement officer and confronting a law enforcement officer. Now, of course, there's different accounts. Um, And I think there is legitimate questions to be asked as to why Officer Wilson shot 6 times. That's a lot of times. And from his side, he says he felt like a 5-year-old taking on Hulk Hogan. Now, that might be an exaggeration. If it's the case that he's lying, then, like I say, we can only hear one side because Michael Brown is dead. So that's why we have to be careful not to just automatically believe Officer Wilson. And what I find interesting about this case, and it was the same on the Trayvon Martin thing, is people automatically assume one person or the other. And just for the record, I'm not one of these people that think, oh, because he's a police officer, he must be telling the truth and he must be a virtuous character. I think people who believe that are idiots. They're just as stupid as those who blindly support Michael Brown. Just because someone wears a uniform doesn't mean that they're automatically truthful. Police all over the world have a track record of covering things up and lying and abusing their authority. So the idea that that is inconceivable is absurd. However, it is also absurd those people who are blindly supporting Michael Brown, even with that footage being available. I think those people are... I don't know what is wrong with them when that footage is available for them to still act like Michael Brown is some sort of saint. It's quite clear this guy was no saint. So we can't know what happened that night. Now, in terms of the racial dynamic, I was reluctant to talk about this because one of my previous videos I was talking about the issue of race baiting, but unfortunately it's impossible not to talk about race. It is very difficult not to do that because it is inevitably a factor. I see two problems. On one hand, it is clear that the black community is disproportionately affected in certain ways in America. There is a disproportionate number of young black men in prison in America. There is a disproportionate number of young black men, in many cases unarmed, shot by white police. Someone said, well, if this was a black officer, they would have no problem. That might be true, but the fact is there is a lot of cases of white officers shooting unarmed young black men. So we can't avoid the fact there is a racial dynamic. And I have absolutely no doubt that racism exists in America. There has been racist statements online, I mean anti-black racist statements that are disgusting. I won't repeat some of the things I've heard, but they do demonstrate that there is unquestionably still deep racism in America. However, there's racism on both sides, and just as there is some white Americans who take a supremacist attitude towards black Americans, there is also what I would call a victimhood mentality. Now, I want to be careful how I say this. I want to try and be diplomatic. There is unquestionably a lot of African Americans who, because they have maybe had bad experience with racial profiling or white racist police, they then automatically turn every single situation into a racism issue. Now, on some hand, it's a human response, because if you're a black guy and you've been stopped by the police for no other reason than your skin tone, then you're going to find it hard to trust white police. I can understand that. The problem is, often this translates then into a hatred or a mistrust of all white people. This isn't reverse racism, it's racism, pure and simple. If you judge, and I made this point in another video, if you judge an entire ethnicity by the actions of some, you are by definition a racist. So frankly, there are black racists in America as well. I said racism is a problem in America, and it is, against black people, but there is also, frankly, this black victimhood mentality also then translates into racism against all white people. And I know these are controversial terms I'm using, but I'm someone who doesn't believe in political correctness. I believe in in calling something for how I see it. And to some extent these issues exist in Britain as well, especially in London. So, my country isn't completely alien to this. From my perspective, more white Americans need to acknowledge that there is a problem of black people suffering disproportionately in certain ways. But African Americans also need to understand that there is a perception, and you can't always complain about racism, because there is a lot of truth in that perception. For example, it is a fact that a lot of young black men do resort to crime. Not everyone, of course not everyone. But just for once, I would like to see some people in the black community condemning crime. Just for once. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that people should be shot for stealing something, but there is a perception issue here. And the perception I think a lot of white Americans have is that black Americans commit crime and don't care. Now, of course, the reality is there are white criminals as well, but let's not beat around the bush. There is a specific problem in big American cities with black gangs. And the black community cannot always use racism as an excuse for that. Also, another issue that isn't often spoken about is black on black crime. So a lot of black Americans complain about racism, but then seemingly turn a blind eye, or certainly don't seem to see it in the same regard, the issue that a lot of the suffering they go through is frankly from other black people. So in other words, I mentioned there's a disproportionate number of young black men in prison, but then there is also a disproportionate number of young black men commit crime. It's not a case that they're in prison for nothing. That might be true in some cases, but in many of those cases they're violent thugs who belong in prison. And I would say exactly the same about violent white thugs. The problem is there's a lack of honesty here, and far too many people seem to be reacting emotionally rather than logistically and thinking simply about facts. Now, the things I'm talking about are certain trends and they are facts, but that doesn't mean it is universal. So when I'm talking about black gangs, I'm not saying for a second there aren't white criminals. Of course there are. I'm just saying that guys like Michael Brown, who rob convenience stores, let's not pretend that that's a small problem in America. It's not. It's a very big problem. Just like there is a lot of white gun nuts who go around with the open carry crowd, and I've made my views on them very clear. So I don't believe I'm racially biased. I am just as critical of white gun nuts as I am of black gang members. I think they're both a problem for America. But there is a lack of honesty, and I get very fed up with people who constantly hide behind a victimhood mentality. That's not to say that people don't have a right to be angry, but if you constantly have a chip on your shoulder and you constantly say it's because I'm black without looking at some of the problems here. For example, okay, I can understand the anger about Michael Brown being killed. What I don't understand is why a lot of those protesters are completely ignoring the video of Michael Brown committing a robbery. And that is significant, because if he's prepared to do that, then it is very conceivable that he put Officer Wilson in a position where he really did fear for his life. In other words, that completely just changes the dynamic, because it's not a case that Officer Wilson is a racist and then went out and shot a young black man. It's a case that he was acting in self-defense. And by the way, for the record, he says he would have done exactly the same if it was a white suspect. Now, whether that's true or not, we don't know, but that's what he said. Some people have also pointed out that there's many examples of white people being killed in the States by black gangs and that getting nowhere near enough media coverage. And frankly, the black community seems silent in those cases. So what I'm trying to get at here is there needs to be consistency on both sides. And maybe, just maybe, then America will start to see people as people rather than through the prism of colour.